All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Wood Chip Heating Fuel Quality Standard for the U.S. webinar. This is a Biomass Thermal Energy Council webinar. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Before we get started with the presentations, I just want to run through a few housekeeping items, and that would include some quick notes on the webinar software that you're using. There are two audio options that are available to you through your computer streaming or through your telephone line. If you have any issues throughout the webinar with the audio quality, I highly recommend switching to the other option, and maybe you'll get a better feed with the other option. Throughout the webinar, our presenters will be providing their presentation. If you have any questions for the presenters, just use the questions tab on the side menu. You just type in your questions there, and at the conclusion of all presentations, we will get to your questions, and we'll try to answer them as best we can. And moving on, the Biomass Thermal Energy Council, we're a national trade association for the modern wood heating industry, and we engage in technical codes and standards development, similar to the U.S. wood chip standard, along with our partners, the Biomass Energy Resource Center, the Innovative Natural Resource Solutions, and the ASABE, as well as ANSI, the American National Standards Institute. We have 60 members and a number of initiatives that you may be interested in. If you have any questions about the Biomass Thermal Energy Council, I encourage you to reach out to our Executive Director, Jeff Surface, or myself, Peter Thompson, Project Assistant, and we'll get you connected in the best way that we can. And with that, I just want to thank everybody again for joining us, and I'm going to hand it off to Adam Sherman of the Biomass Energy Resource Center. Adam, take it away.
All right, thanks, Peter. So welcome, everyone. Really thank you for joining us on this session to discuss the new voluntary wood chip heating fuel quality standard for the U.S. Again, my name is Adam Sherman. I work for an organization called the Biomass Energy Resource Center, or BERC. We are a part of a nonprofit organization based in Vermont, but we work all over North America on initiatives and projects and programs to advance the use of modern wood heating and combined heat and power across the residential and commercial sectors to directly displace fossil fuels and meet carbon targets and help create markets for low-grade wood throughout the continent. So I'd like to take a few moments and just walk you through our game plan for our time together on the webinar and give you an outline of the presentation. First, I'd like to start with giving a little bit of background on the need for a standard and provide some of the context of, well, why was this developed in the first place? And next, I'll spend a little bit of time of talking about the players involved and who was on the primary team and the technical advisory committee that helped provide critical input on the standard development. And then also with the help of Gene Walsh from ASABE, we'll talk a little bit about the standard development process that was used and the rigors of that process. And then we'll move on to the real meat of the presentation, which will be a summary of the final standard as it was adopted and how it differs from other standards. So we'll get into the weeds of the standard. I think that's what most people really are on the webinar to hear about. But then lastly, we will provide a quick discussion of, all right, so now that we have a standard, how can it be put to use in the real world? And I'll be joined by Jim Dooley from Forest Concepts to cover that ground. And then at the end, we'll have time for some Q&A. And I should also just note that I'll be moving fairly quickly through some content. Just a reminder that the slides will be made available afterwards. So if there's something that I really just skimmed over and you want to dive deeper into it, that content will be made available. But also I want to remind everyone on the webinar that there is a website with a lot of detail, a lot of content about this that was developed. And I'll put up the hyperlink to that website at the end of the webinar. So bear with us, and yeah, we'll get rolling. So next slide. All right, so I'd like to start by just giving a quick introduction to the team that worked on this project. BERC was the lead organization, but pulled together an excellent team. The folks at Innovative Natural Resource Solutions, Charlie Niebling and Charles Levesque, were vital partners, and they led the stakeholder engagement process for this initiative, the outreach, as well as the formation and coordination of the technical and advisory committees, and just played a really vital role in this overall project. Of course, BTEC was a critical partner, and David Bancroft and Peter Thompson both played really important roles throughout the initiative, both on the technical side, the process side, but really provided a lot of vital outreach and engagement of the BTEC membership to build awareness and engagement on this process. And lastly, I have to really give a big shout out to the American Society of Agricultural and Biological Engineers, the team of Gene Walsh and Scott Cederquist. Were absolutely essential in leading us and guiding us through sometimes technical processes in the standard adoption process. We have a great team really with the expertise and experience in understanding the wood heating market and wood chip fuel supply chains, but ASABE were really a vital partner to guide us through the complex process of the standard adoption. So next slide. So this all was funded with the generous support of a grant from the U.S. Forest Service Wood Education Resource Center work in the form of a 2016 Wood Innovation Grant. We're incredibly thankful for their support and involvement throughout the duration of this project. I should also just say that the U.S. Forest Service has been a critical partner and supporter of the wood energy and the wood heating market for decades, and continues to provide vital support and leadership in this area. And so we just have to give them express our total gratitude for that. So next slide. So to set things up a little bit, the context behind this, it's important to realize that the focus of this initiative to develop a standard was really on the use of wood chips as a fuel for commercial scale heating. I mean, really residential to commercial scale heating. So what does that mean? That means a target range of boiler capacities ranging from residential size of 100,000 BTU per hour to a very large institutional or district heating boiler systems ranging in the 30 to 40 million BTU per hour range. How that translates, if you're not versed in those metrics of boiler size capacity, essentially it's boilers burning between say 4 tons a year to 40,000 tons per year. But I think it's important to realize as we get into the weeds of this, that the standard is not intended to cover wood chips used for other applications as a feedstock for pellet making or for torrefication or biochemical production or pulp and paper, or even as boiler fuel for large power plants. So we were really specific about drawing those boundaries on what the standard is intended to be used for. So I think that's important to get right out on the table early on. It's also important to remember that there's really the context of this is that there's a huge growth opportunity throughout the US to dramatically increase the use of commercial scale wood chip heating. There are many regions, rural forested regions of the US that have heat and cooling demand where wood chips can be used as a boiler fuel to directly displace oil and propane across the entire US. So that's the real big picture vision. But I think it's important to remember that we won't achieve the market growth opportunity if it's not done in a way that's clean, efficient, and yields high, predictable performance. Not only to do that, but to be perceived as clean, efficient, and achieving high performance. And so this industry has a long history of we can burn anything in terms of how wood chip heated facilities and equipment is being marketed. And I think that's starting to change. So I think the standard plays into that evolution from the long history of we can burn anything Wild West approach to a more standardized, predictable fuel matching of the fuel with the technology that is using it. So this initiative was launched to address that one small crucial step, but really trying to make the big impact. Next slide. So to achieve the desired market growth, there needs to be all of these vital links, but also the integration of all of the links into a holistic chain. And I think a lot of time is spent in the industry looking at developing and promoting the state-of-the-art combustion equipment, but that's just one piece to the overall system. We need to have the know-how to produce the desired grades of wood chips, the fuel that meets the specifications, and the best-in-class equipment if we're going to get the desired outcomes of optimal system performance. And of course, that in turn leads to the building market confidence and regulatory confidence that we need to expand the use of wood chip heating. So we believe that the voluntary fuel wood chip fuel quality standard and the supplemental user guide produced as part of this initiative will go a long way to help connect these vital links. Next slide. So further background, I think it's important to note that there are a number of things going on. First off, in the US, there's no widely adopted and recognized wood chip fuel quality standard. Well, there wasn't before, there is now, but that's the context of when we got going in 2016. The other is that every other major heating fuel that wood chips compete with, heating oil, propane, natural gas, and even wood pellets, have unambiguous fuel standards that are certified by a recognized agency. And so that creates the consistency and predictability when the market is looking to make investments in a natural gas boiler, knowing that the natural gas fuel that's going to go into that piece of equipment will yield the desired results and performance. This is the market that we're competing against, and we're trying to get on a level playing field with those options that people have when they're talking about how to heat their facilities. So another piece of this is just there has been increased regulation. And I'll talk a little bit more about this on the next slide, but if we're not proactive as an industry and get out in front of this, there's a good chance that that regulators will start specifying fuels and creating the standards themselves. So I think getting out in front and having a proactive voluntary standard is just a wise move all around. Next slide. So a little bit further context, we have seen some indications of greater regulation rolling out at the federal, state, and local level. We also have a marketplace that has greater awareness of particulate emissions and from wood fuels amongst the general public, but also amongst air quality regulators. We also are seeing improvements in the fossil heating fuels, where wood chips and wood pellets are competing, and they're bioblends that are getting cleaner. We're seeing developments and improvements in number 2 heating oil. I think it's also important to note that there's public expectation that wood fuels must be as clean as possible, and especially given the history of the outdoor wood boilers that have been on the market and kind of giving the industry a black eye. And just the overall dim outlook that public health officials have about wood heating in general, so that it's not being painted with a single brushstroke and characterized with the performance and emission profile of outdoor wood boilers. So next slide. I think another piece of the why is just that there's a lot of subjective terms historically used throughout the industry, and I think this laundry list of subjective terms, it's important to note that not only are they subjective and there's not a whole lot of meaning behind them without a standard, but also what these terms mean to a producer of the chips may be dramatically different than what it means from the consumer or an engineer or a regulator. And so continuing to rely on these vague terminology without a standard has caused confusion in the market, and that's another benefit to moving to a voluntary standard. Next slide. So really, ultimately, what we're shooting for here are matching the right fuel to the right boiler, building consumer confidence, and providing clear guidance to the producer to yield the consistency, but also to simplify and troubleshoot potential issues with the combustion systems. There's a long legacy of projects that started up, ran into some technical problems, and immediately the culprit was, oh, well, it's your fuel supply. It's not our combustion system. It must be you fed the wrong chips to it. So we're trying to eliminate those types of situations and ultimately increase the confidence and quality assurance that leads to the growth in the market. So next slide. So back in 2016, when we first got started, we put together a 15-member technical advisory committee, developed a wood chip standard website to house all of the information and updates to allow stakeholders to track the progress of the standard as it was being developed, and built a comprehensive stakeholder list where regular updates were given over the course of the project. And then over the course of the project, we did a lot to build awareness and involvement, included the email blast, the website, a number of press articles in Biomass Magazine and other trade magazines, as well as a number of presentations at conferences in select regions throughout the US over the last 2 years. So a lot of outreach has been done. Next slide. Also, we put together, so next slide. So put together a stakeholder category. This is not just for the stakeholders who we engaged for broad input, but also to put together the 15-member advisory committee. We worked really hard to get a diverse group together to look at the issue of the development of a wood chip heating fuel standard from a number of different perspectives. And so we had involvement from the US Forest Service, boiler manufacturers, chipping and grinding equipment manufacturers, forestry, general energy consultants, university and academia, NGOs, air quality regulators, boiler safety experts, and then also mechanical and agricultural engineers. So a good diverse group that contributed to this process. And I think that's a real reason that the standard has been successful in what we ended with. Next slide. So the advisory committee started out, and we had really 3 potential pathways that we could go down with this initiative. The first was we could develop a new standard for the US market. The next option was to adopt an existing standard, or the third option was we could adopt an existing standard but make some modifications for the US market. And there are some established methodologies that ASAB and ANSI have for doing that third option. So we had to look at each of those and quickly figure out which path we're going to go down to get to the end goal. Next slide. So to answer that question of which path we should go down, we really first had to look at some of the existing standards and take inventory of what was already out there, what they covered, how they did it, and figure out how applicable it would be for the U.S. market. So we took a close look at these existing standards from around the world, the EN 3505 and 14961 from the European Union. We also looked at the ISO 17225-4 standard, which is the International Institute for International Organization for Standardization. The O-norm standard came out of Austria. We looked at, and then also looked at the Canadian, the CSA standard that was a straight up adoption of the ISO 17225-4 standard. So we looked at all of those, but also in addition, we looked at some regionally adopted specifications that were commonly in use in the market. We certainly also gathered boiler vendor specifications of what they listed and communicated to their customers. When you buy our equipment, here's the grade of wood chip and the technical specifications that our systems are designed to burn. And then we also looked at wood chip fuel quality lab reports to better understand how common grades of wood chips would align with these existing international standards. Next slide. So this table it's really busy and it's really small print, so I apologize. But the gist of this is that the table shows the three major standards that are widely used, especially in Europe. And ultimately what they cover in terms of the various quality parameters. So it's important to note that the O-norm, the EN, and the ISO standards just cover, some cover more ground and others less. The O-norm focus on really just the key quality parameters. The EN standard expands upon the O-norm, but then includes two critical elements of nitrogen and chlorine. And then the ISO is the most comprehensive of all, building upon the O-norm and the EN, but expanding it to cover a wide range of elements that only, you should note that only the grade B fuel applies to those, those elemental analysis. I'll get more into these details in subsequent slides, but this kind of just lines it up, and it was part of our decision-making process on which path to move forward on. So next slide. So again, another fairly legible table, but the gist of this is that we were looking at the three different approaches that we had and just wanted to look at the pros and cons for each one. We can modify a standard, we can adopt a standard, or we can create something new from scratch. And so looking at a number of different criteria, looking at the various pros and cons of each approach led to, next slide, led to a decision of adapting the ISO standard for the US market. And so the reasons that the advisory committee made that decision and felt that that was the best process to move forward with was that the ISO standard is widely adopted in Europe and around the world. It had recently just been adopted verbatim by the Canadian Standards Association without any deviations. But where we chose to focus on for the modifications or deviations of the standard were around creating greater allowances for how the fuel is processed from big pieces of wood into small pieces of wood. The ISO standard really was limited to chipping with knives. We wanted to allow greater agnostic approach to how you take big pieces and make small pieces to have a usable fuel meeting the specification. So the emphasis was more on the outcome and the performance of the fuel itself and less dictated by how you did it. And then also to make some modifications to the chip size classification and some of the breakpoints in the moisture content subclassification, including a slight increase in the moisture content allowances within the grade 1A and 1B, but I'll speak more about those in subsequent slides. So with that, I'm going to pause and hand it over to Gene Walsh with ASABE to segue on this slide and into the next slide, talk about process.
Thank you, Adam. This is Jean Walsh with the American Society of Agriculture and Biological Engineers, also known as ASABE or ASABE by some people. One thing I just wanted to point out before we move to the next slide is that in choosing the ISO standard, I just want to take you back a little bit because the development of an ISO standard itself can take up to 4 years as the international members discuss and revise the content. This takes place during a specified series of steps designed to move this document closer to publication as each phase is approved by a consensus of the participating countries. So what we ended up adopting already had been in a very extensive process of development. So if we can go to the next slide, please. I just wanted to give you a little overview of the process that we actually went through. The ASABE and ANSI processes are similar in that they both have specific requirements for openness, balance of interest areas, and stakeholder representation, and consensus to move toward publication. ASABE, as an ANSI accredited standards development organization, has a little bit more detailed steps documented in our development process. ANSI requires that we have the openness, the interest areas, and the public notifications as requirements in the process, and they don't look at the content of the standard so much as the process by which it's developed. So we're judged on the process. If our process is approved, then they turn that over to us. So the public notifications portion is really what provides the greater openness in the process, so that during our balloting, we're balloting the advisory committee that was formed, but we're also notifying the public through public notification that ANSI puts out that anyone can request a copy of this draft that we're working on and can also comment on it. And while we did the public notification through ANSI, we also had the 400 plus stakeholders notified that Adam had mentioned earlier, that this draft was available for review. And in the case of this process, we did receive approximately 34 people who contacted me and requested a copy of the draft to review it, one of which actually came back with some comments. Our first ballot was approved by the voting body, but the comments came in during the open process, and the group had to consider the comments and how to resolve them, and ended up making some adjustments to the ballot or the draft itself, which in turn had to go for a second ballot so that the group could review and vote to approve the additional changes that were made. And all of that went through the regular ASABE process of not only the adoption and by the advisory committee, but also a review of the process that they went through. And once that was done through ASABE, we turned the documentation of the process over to ANSI, the American National Standards Institute. And what they do is review the process that we went through to verify that we did follow the openness, the balanced members of the committee, and made sure that the voting body actually did have the correct number of votes for approval. after which they put their endorsement on it. And so once it's endorsed by the American National Standards Institute, ANSI, then it becomes an ANSI standard, and we can put that name on it. It gives it a little bit more gravitas. What I wanted to also let you know is it was formally adopted February 2018, as it notes here. And if you were to look at the standard itself, I've had a couple of calls on this one, it's not going to look quote, quote, clean as everyone would expect. What we are required to do when we adopt in ISO standard is to very clearly show in modification what we are removing or what will not be considered as part of the standard any longer as the national adoption, and what we are adding. So if you were to look at the standard itself, you will see some areas that are red, and you'll see strike-throughs. If we have a strike-through highlighted in red on the document, that means that it is not considered part of the national adoption of the document. And then the additions that we put in are also in red so that it highlights, and we underline those as well in case you don't have a color printer or are seeing it only in black and white. So it's very obvious what the additions are and what the subtractions are. And ISO does allow regional bodies to do this adoption because they recognize that various parts of the world have different needs and regulations. So this allows us to take all of the work that was developed over those 4 years and really take a close look at it and decide what is really relevant for our markets and make those modifications, which is exactly what happened here. And we ended up with, next slide, the ANSI ASABE AD, meaning adopted with deviation, 17225-4. It keeps the same number and the exact same title as the ISO. The ANSI ASABE AD identifies that as a national adoption. And so this is now available for purchase from ASABE as well as some of our resellers and for general use in the United States. So turning it back over to Adam.
Right. Thanks, Jean. Thank you for providing the summary on the process. So yeah, this is really exciting. We now have the standard, and I'd like to take a few minutes now on the webinar to walk you through some of the details of the new voluntary standard that has been created. I should just say that as we move through some of the components of the standard as it was adopted, that the advisory committee process, the approach that was used to develop this was to review the ISO standard and really try to keep things the same as much as possible, and really only deviate in places where something in the ISO standard didn't make any sense and where there was a clear solution that was aligned with the reality of the market in the US. And so as we go through the next couple of slides to delve into the weeds of the standard, I'll talk about, what it is in the US or in the ISO standard, and then how, if at all, our standard deviates from the ISO standard. But I just want to make sure that people understand that as much as possible, we tried to keep it as consistent with the ISO standard, and that was one of the reasons we took this approach, was to create greater international consistency. So next slide. So the major qualitative parameters that the standard addresses are the source of the wood fuel, particle size, moisture content, ash content, and bulk density, as well as the elemental composition, and that aligns directly with the ISO standard. It's important to note that as we go through these various quality parameters, that each have sub-classifications specific to that individual quality parameter, and that the parameters, some parameters affect the overall grade of the wood chips and some don't. And so I'll try to highlight those as we go through them, but please keep in mind that some of these, there's essentially two levels of the gradation. There's sub-grading specific to particle size, moisture content, ash content, bulk density, and then there's also a overall gradation. As I go through the slides, hopefully that point becomes clearer. So next slide. So wood fuel sources, the US standard, well, the ISO standard had a lot of unclear and overlapping categories for wood fuel sources, and we worked to streamline the categories under two main headers: wood coming directly out of the forest, and then wood residues coming from primary and secondary wood product manufacturing. So this includes, within the forest, plantation, and other virgin wood category, whole trees without roots, stem wood, and logging residues, primarily the tops and limbs from timber harvest, as well as the byproducts from the wood processing industry that were limited to wood fibers that were untreated in any form chemically. So this deviates from the ISO standard, where the ISO 17225-4 does have some allowances for chemically treated wood sources, and we deviated to categorically exclude any form of chemically treated wood fiber in the standard. But we also changed and deviated from the ISO standard in that the source of the wood fuel does not automatically predetermine the overall wood chip quality grade. And the advisory committee felt that the standard should prescribe the performance specifications, but shouldn't dictate how you produce a given quality of chip. And so that was kind of a high-level philosophical difference that led us to create this deviation on the wood fuel source piece. Next slide. So particle size is the next quality parameter, following the kind of order of, not importance, but the order of sequence in the ISO standard. There are 5 subclassifications for particle size: the P9.5, the P16, the P25, the P38, and the P50s. And so the deviation from the ISO standard was just minor adjustments to the ranges in those categories, but then also the use of US imperial units rather than metric. And it's important to note that the particle size designation does not directly impact the overall chip grade in terms of the A1, A2, B1, B2 grades as it had been in the ISO 17225 standard. Next slide. Moisture content, critical quality parameter for the value of a wood chip heating fuel. There are 6 subclassifications for moisture content, spanning the overall grade of A1, A2, and B. One of the deviations that our standard had was the merger of the B1 and B2. There was no clear distinction between a B1 and B2, so they were all lumped together into a grade B. But we deviated from the ISO standard by increasing the tolerance or allowance for moisture content greater than 35% to still qualify for the A1 status. The ISO standard, if you're over 35%, you were automatically bumped over from A1 status to A2. Our committee felt that the wood chips as received is an important, the moisture content of the wood chips as received is important, but we needed to have greater allowance for the potential for on-site drying of the chips. So we recognized the importance of low moisture content in the overall grade, but felt that a little bit more flexibility, allowing more moist chips was appropriate, and a deviation from the ISO standard. Next slide. So no changes to ash content, but it is a critical quality parameter. There are 3 ash-based subclassifications: less than 1.0% ash content, less than or equal to 1.5% ash content, and then less than 3% ash content, aligning with the A1, A2, and B grades. So ash content is really the single greatest determining factor for the overall grade of the wood chip quality in the ANSI ASA BE AD 17225-4 standard. And this is directly aligned with the ISO standard, no deviation here. Next slide. So the new standard does include guidance on bulk density. It's virtually the same as the ISO standard, but applies common US units. The ISO standard provides some informational guidance on typical bulk density based on the moisture content for breaking out hardwoods and softwoods. There are 4 subclassifications of bulk density: the 150, the 200, the 250, and the 300. But it's important to note that the bulk density has less relevance in the US market than it does in Europe, where it is fairly common to purchase wood chip fuel on a volume basis and not on weight. And so it's also important to note that bulk density is, very highly influenced by the moisture content, which is already addressed in a separate part of the standard. So we provided these modifications to inform on bulk density, but felt that it was less critical in determining the overall gradation of the standard. Next slide. So elemental composition, for elemental composition, there were no deviations made from the ISO standard. These are essentially directly as they came out of the ISO standard. It is important, again, to note that the thresholds listed here in this table are only for grade B chips. Essentially only applies to chips with ash content between or over 1.5% and less than or equal to 3.0% ash content. So anything over 3% ash content is excluded completely from the standard, but it's only elemental composition reporting required for the grade B. It is not required for grade A1 or A2 chips. Next slide. So this is it's a busy flow chart, but I think it's good to step back from the weeds of the previous slides and tables and look at and map out the big picture here. This simplified flow chart gives us the landscape view, starting at the top with wood fuel, the wood sources, and working our way down through moisture content and ash content to come to the overall chip quality grade. And so it's important to note that wood chips are excluded from the standard based on chemical treatment, high ash content over 3.0%, or any high levels of heavy metals. But those excluded in the kind of red boxes, it's important to note that while they fall outside the range of this standard for a wood chip heating fuel, that they still may be, very suitable for many other uses that wood chips are commonly used for: power plant, boiler fuel, compost, mulch, you name it. They're just excluded from the heating fuel under the standard. One thing to also note is that the flow chart here excludes the particle size step in the process that would come after wood source and come before moisture content, but it was excluded just because the particle size it has all the sub classifications but doesn't impact the overall grade like moisture and ash content do. So hopefully this gives you a landscape level of how the various fuel quality parameters impact the overall grading of the A1, A2, and grade B classifications. Now I am going to switch gears and shift the discussion over to some thinking about how the use of the standard in the real world can be applied. And I'll turn things over to Jim Dooley with Forest Concepts, Inc. Jim?
Okay, next slide, please. I gotta make sure I can see the same slide you're seeing. Good afternoon, everyone. As Adam noted, the wood chip standard is a voluntary industry standard and it's not a law. So the rate of adoption depends on how many chip suppliers and fuel buyers adopt and begin using the new chip specifications in your sales and purchase transactions. My company, Forest Concepts, is both a feedstock producer and a purchaser of wood chips. And since we live on both sides of transactions involving the standards, we're among the early adopters. The classification system flowchart that Adam showed on the last slide may look a bit daunting, but the rollout of the standard includes a lot of help. As I mentioned, the BTEC, BERC, and others have been giving presentations and workshops at stakeholder events around the country. More are planned and will be listed on the website. But most importantly, the woodchipstandard.org website is available 24/7 and includes a very well put together guidance handbook to lead you through implementation, whether you're a fuel producer or a fuel buyer. Next slide. Shown here are the cover pages of both the user guide and an associated 2-page summary introduction. We encourage you to download the user guide as soon as this webinar is over and print also a few copies of the summary to go over with your own customers and suppliers to bring them on board. Next slide. In the user guide is a section after the kind of content that Adam went through, but in much more detail on how you actually execute the testing. And in that user guide, there's a section on strategies for producers of chips and for distributors and users of chips. And this table is out of that section. In the next slide, we'll talk about the second part of storage and handling at the destination. But in the user guide, key things that it points out is getting the particle size right, not degrading particle size during handling, those kinds of things. But probably one of the most important pieces of equipment chip producers need, other than a chipper with sharp knives, is a good chip screen. Unfortunately, most chip suppliers rely on industrial customers to screen after delivery. But as this small user market develops, small boiler operators, district heat, are going to rely on the chip supplier to pre-screen material to take out the overs and the sticks, as well as the sawdust and the fines. And so screening to assure particle sizes on spec for the boiler manufacturer specification is going to move more and more to the chip supplier. Moisture is also a big deal. You would never want to burn green or wet logs in your own home fireplace, and wet fuel has low net energy, greatly increases emissions, and it has worse flowability and more probability of plugging in boiler feed systems than dry fuel. So please do whatever you can to keep your chip fuels dry. Again, this is a difference between this market and the large industrial market. You produce clean chips if you pile them on unpaved pads. Often the gravel and dirt that you add during loading into your truck for delivery aren't accounted for in the standards testing that you've done to certify your fuel as meeting a particular ash content. But when the customer receives it, if they do their own test and it contains lots of parking lot gravel or soil or bark from whatever's on the deck, that can compromise the quality and compromise the functional performance. So next slide. The same applies to customers and end users of wood chip fuels. You paid for dry chips, you received dry chips, and it's incumbent on chip buyers and users to figure out how to keep them out of the rain and snow before they're loaded into the boiler feed hopper. Again, storing on well-maintained sites under cover is vital to maintain this quality that you need and assure the performance of your boiler system. Again, the user guide and website include good business practices beyond just the technical standard. And importantly, all of us in the supply chain, as Adam noted on like his first or second slide, from logger or arborist to fuel producer and fuel user, are in it together to deliver energy efficient wood heat with minimal emissions and operational issues. And with that, we end the technical part of this presentation. I'll turn it back to Adam for closing and questions.
All right, next slide. Bear with me, folks. Shifting gears on my computer here. Okay, so I'd like to wrap up by just reiterating a point that was made earlier in the webinar, that all these links in the system are vital to the overall market success, and each link needs to connect with the whole chain. We're all in this together, and we really need to create system performance that provides the market and regulatory trust and confidence. And with that, we can grow the commercial scale wood chip heating market across the US. So that's what it's all about. Look forward to working with all of you to get the user guide and the standard out into use. Next slide. Here are the names and contact information for the team members that were responsible for this work. But I do want to encourage everyone to go to the woodchipstandard.org website, download the various materials, including the user guide. This site has a lot of the background and some of the process documents that got us to the end standard, hyperlinks to other resources out there in terms of the international standards and where to go to learn more about some of the other international standards, but also provides useful documents like a wood fuel procurement RFP template for purchasing wood fuels and aligning that with the standard. So there's a lot of great resources available on the website. So I encourage you all to go there and then also help us spread the awareness of the standard being out there and available to get more buyers and suppliers using the standard across the country. So with that, I think we'll stop and switch gears over to the Q&A. So Peter, I on my screen am looking at the questions, but I'm actually having a hard time getting the full view. Would you be willing to read off some of the select questions that you think are needing to be answered, and we can do that as a tag team effort?
Sure, yeah, and also you can hit the pop-up window. It's a little box with an arrow that should help you with the view, but I'll get us started on the Q&A, and then you can jump in once you get that opened up. All right, so first question coming in from Julie Tucker of the Forest Service. What have been the unintended outcomes or impacts, positive or negative, of the standard now that it is final? Adam, Gene, or Jim, would you like to take on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take a crack at it. You know, it is so new that I don't think we've seen the full consequences, positive or negative, just because it's relatively new. We are still trying to get it out into the market and into the users' hands. We certainly have received a number of questions from our counterparts in Canada and even the European Biomass Association, inquiring about, why did we deviate from ISO on certain matters, because the ISO standard every couple of years gets updated. So they were curious to know how what we have done with our modifications should guide and influence their thinking in subsequent iterations of the ISO standard. So that's kind of been an interesting development. But I think in terms of the US market, time will tell as this gets picked up and used more widely. I think a lot of people are supportive of the notion that a standard be performance driven, and that the approach we took on not dictating the overall fuel quality by the wood fuel sources and the equipment used to produce the fuel, I think that has been pretty well received across the boards, that we didn't want to stifle innovation. If someone could make a better grinder or chipper, we didn't want to predetermine the overall grade by how you do it.
This is Jim Dooley. We haven't yet had a transaction where we were required to specify, but we have a biomass test lab for all our own products, and we were quite successful at adapting this to a laboratory test protocol, and so we've got that part figured out. And I know Charlie Niebling, who's also on this call, may be able to comment. I know he's had a successful transaction or two using this standard.
Yeah, Charlie here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. We have actually used the standard in a proposal that we submitted to a school district in New Hampshire that is contemplating the purchase of a semi-dry chip for a new boiler installation. Perhaps I'm the first one who has utilized the standard. I'm not sure, but I'm happy to say that we incorporated it into our proposal. We referenced the fuel that we intend to offer to them by the classification, the grade classification, as well as the moisture content and ash content and chip size. And we're hopeful, and in the process of providing that to them, we used the guidebook and the 2-pager to help educate them about how to utilize the standard in their own fuel procurement. So we're hopeful it's not the first that we will be doing, but happy to see it getting used.
So it looks like the next question was from Andrew Perchlik, asking, can there be greater than 50% moisture content and less than 1.5% ash? If so, what is the chip classification? So if it's greater than 50% moisture content, it is a grade B, whether or not it has a lower ash content. So great question, good clarification. Probably not entirely clear from the flow chart at first glance, but it's an either or type thing where even if you're lower on one, if you're over 50% moisture content, you are in the grade B category. Hopefully that answers your question. Let's see, next question was, does BTEC know of any boiler manufacturers who have started using the standard to identify acceptable wood fuel for their boilers? Coming in from Steve. I'll answer that, even though it was directed at BTEC. I would say that I had a conversation with Bede Welford from Viessmann USA USA, they have, for their product, used the ISO standard and spec'd in alignment and educated their customer base on the grade of chip that their various products can handle. And he is he's aware of the standard, was involved in the development of the standard, and has been developing materials to reflect the US standard rather than continuing to reference the ISO standard. So one example, Peter or Charlie or others, are you familiar with other examples?
Off the top of my head, no. Right now, we're kind of in an education mode and building the awareness amongst our membership on the wood chip standard. We've been communicating with them over the past several months over its development. We have received a lot of interest with the wood chip standard, so we'll continue to monitor that. And as people start adopting it, I think we'll start to see those results become more apparent.
Great. Next question that came in from Glenn Robinson. Can a flowchart be provided that has all of the labels in the chart that would be easy for a consumer to look at the chart and say, I want or need this? So yes, in the user guide and also the 2-page summary, there are flowcharts and tables. And in the user guide, a lot more detailed discussion that would get directly at the question that you're posing, Glenn. So great question. Please, I would encourage you to go to the website and download those documents, and should get you what you need. Looks like the next question came in from Sebnem. Hi, Sebnem. Good to see you. You're on the call. Is BTEC aware of any fuel producers that are grinding the woody biomass and matching the fuel standard? Yeah, good question. I don't know. Anyone else on the call familiar with any examples of fuel suppliers? I mean, I think all of the fuel suppliers currently produce fuel that falls into the spectrum. How many of them are currently and actively matching and aligning? That's a good question, and time will tell.
This is Jim Dooley. So far, I think Charlie's use of it in a procurement spec is among the first. We're so early in this. Our company has a capability to, as customers require it. But Mark Froling from Froling Energy was one of the technical stakeholders and advisors. And Froling Energy produces modified wood chips that have a controlled moisture and size that's optimized for certain manufacturers' boilers. And their products can easily be labeled under this standard from our interpretation. So you may want to talk to Froling Energy to see how they're implementing it.
All right. There are a couple other comments, but that seems to be what we have for questions coming in right now. Maybe we can wait a couple of minutes and see if there are any lingering questions that come in. Yeah. From the team, Charlie Niebling, Gene Walsh, Peter, and Jim, any other kind of parting thoughts or points that we didn't make in the content of the presentation?
This is Jean. I just want to let everyone know that while the team did their best to anticipate the use of this and how it's going to be implemented, a standard is a living document, and so this standard will be reviewed in 5 years as it's required, and there could be some slight adjustments that have been found as it's been used. So if you are one of the people using the standard and you find that there are some areas that need to be tweaked or looked at, please don't hesitate to contact me, and I can keep record of that so that when we do come up for our review, we can make this an even better standard.
Yeah, great point. Thank you, Jean. All right, looks like we got another comment that came in. Would it be worth touching on the importance between our driveways waste to your content and wet-based? Huh, I'm not sure. Oh, dry weight. Okay, thank you. Dry weight based. Go ahead.
Yeah, great question. In the forest products industry, if you come from one part of the industry, all moisture is on a dry weight basis. And so something that's got 50% wet weight moisture has got 100% dry weight moisture, and it's a huge source of confusion and has been in the wood chip fuel market, just like hog fuel and clean chips and dirty chips and whole tree chips and bull chips has been over the years. The ISO moisture content for biofuels is a different standard, but all the biofuel standards internationally are based on a wet weight basis, which is also what most other materials outside the forest products industry are sold on. So the assumptions here are that moisture is on a wet weight basis. And I think that's clear in the user guide and in the standard itself.
All right, another question came in. Do you know of any institution working in the standardization of other biomass, like switchgrass, corn stover, etc.? Jean, perhaps you would be a good one to take that.
Well, as far as we're concerned at ASABE, we don't have any other national group, but the ISO standards organizations, there's 238, which is dealing with solid biofuels, and they're always looking for people who are interested. We do have a US based committee. Each country is represented by what they call a mirror committee, or in our case, a tag of experts who will review ISO standards as they're being developed and take part in the actual development of them. So that might be something to look into. And my supervisor, Scott Cedarquist, is in charge of the US tag for TC238 solid biofuels. So you can please contact me and maybe we can get you hooked up with that. He has more information on the solid biofuel issues nationally and internationally, and so I would say he would be our source, and I could easily get you some information that way.
All right. Great. If there are any other questions, please get them in now. We don't see anything in the next few minutes. We will move to adjourn. Peter, anything else you want to add as the convener of the webinar?
Sure. The webinar recording and the presentations will be posted on the BTEC website as well as the Woodchip Standard website in the next couple of days. So just look out for those. We'll send a follow-up email to everybody with the links to those materials, probably by Friday, just to get the recording set up. And yeah, that's basically all I have for everybody. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and I want to thank our partners, especially the Biomass Resource Center, Biomass Energy Resource Center, for involving us in the development of the standard, as well as the other partners, ASABE and Innovative Natural Resource Solutions. We are incredibly grateful for you guys involving us into this, into the development of the standard.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.